You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
This is the CRM Archaeology Podcast. It's the show where we pull back the veil of cultural resources management, archaeology, and discuss the issues that everyone is concerned about. Welcome to the podcast. Hello and welcome to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 127 for January 3rd, 2018. Happy New Year. I'm your host, Chris Webster. On today's show, we talked to Ryan Howell, an archaeologist in the Midwest, about the Minnesota SHPO situation that we referred to in episode 126, and about unions in CRM. So bust out your copy of the National Historic Preservation Act, because the CRM Archaeology Podcast starts right now. Welcome to the show, everyone. Joining me today is Sonia in Utah.
Hello.
Stephen in Calgary.
Hi.
And I'm just going to say this in case he does show up, but Bill White might be in an airport somewhere calling in randomly. You might just hear his voice show up on the podcast, so I'll introduce him now just in case. If not, Bill's with us in spirit. So, all right. So we are recording this at before the new year, but as I said at the beginning of the show, this is coming out on January 3rd. So happy New Year, everybody. This is the first CRM Arc podcast of 2018. And we're getting dangerously close to our 5-year anniversary of this podcast, which I'll have to check the date, but it's sometime in February that we did our first show. It will be 5 years ago in this February. So that's pretty crazy. 127 episodes so far. I think that'll be around 130 episodes, give or take, when we hit that mark. So that's pretty neat. Kind of amazing we've kept it going this long. Kind of amazing Stephen is still here. And Bill, they were part of the original crew. Sonia's been here for a couple years now, right, Sonia?
Yeah, a few. I think a few. I've been around for a while.
For a while. All right. So let me introduce our guest who's patiently waiting. And our guest is, and if you're familiar with the Archaeo Field Techs group on Facebook or the North American Archaeological Tech Forum on Facebook, which we talk about a lot on this show because a lot of really good conversations happen in there. Ryan Howell is a relatively frequent poster and commenter in those groups, and he recently started a discussion that we're going to talk about today. So welcome to the show, Ryan.
Howdy. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So you're calling in from, are you in Minnesota right now?
I am based in Wisconsin, but I work in both Wisconsin and Minnesota.
Okay, sounds good. So you're up in that area. You're in the thick of things. So we talked on the last episode, and we'll link to this in the show notes, episode 126, about the idea, and this was based on the topic that Ryan started in those two Facebook groups, about the Minnesota SHPO and possibly losing the SHPO for a little while or having things change. We weren't really sure what was going on. And we had a show on episode 126 that was kind of theoretical on what would you do if there weren't a SHPO. What would happen if a state lost its SHPO for some reason or decided to not fund it or whatever the reason is? What is that? What does a SHPO do, and how would that impact what we do as archaeologists? So what we're going to talk about now, because we couldn't back then because we didn't really have a lot of the particulars, and we weren't in the area to really talk about that. That's why we brought Ryan on now. So Ryan, why don't you tell us what prompted this whole thing, and then we'll kind of get into what's going on now.
Sure. I'll try and give you the semi-shortened version of it. Essentially, what had happened was a bill had been passed in the Minnesota State Legislature, whereby the SHPO, which had been part of the Minnesota Historical Society, and therefore was essentially a private organization outside of state government, which was unlike most SHPOs in the United States. I think there's only one or two that are still functioning like that, would become part of the Department of Administration, which would be then part of not only be part of state government, would be essentially be part of the governor's office in the state. And therefore, the SHPO would be directly responsible for their jobs, for their funding, for their budgets to the governor's office of Minnesota. And the backstory had been in several of the papers, and you can look this up online if you want, that essentially it had been passed as a kind of revenge measure for SHPO determinations that had halted several mining developments in northern Minnesota. And there was a thought that SHPO was kind of a rogue agency from a political point of view that was not susceptible to political forces, be they campaign contributions or party politics or whatever, that they were essentially an independent review agency, which is what they were, and that needed to change. And so that came into being in March of 2017. And then there was going to be a 9-month period of kind of study and overhaul and comment that was going to end on the 31st of December. And then there would be an audit of SHPO to determine what of SHPO needed to move, what of SHPO needed to change, and how SHPO was going to be integrated into essentially the governor's administration department.
Okay. Well, I guess my first fundamental question about that is, if most SHPOs are actually in the state buildings and they're in state offices in other states, and it's rare for them to be in a historical society or something like that, how would moving them and creating that actually be better for developers? How would that be like a revenge move if they're actually making it more like the status quo?
Well, I think there's an implied. That's a good question. I think there's an implied thing that if you are responsible for your salary, your positions, and your funding, your resources, everything else, especially to a governor's office, the Department of Administration basically grew out of the governor's secretary typing pool in the 1940s. Mm-hmm. So it is essentially directly, outside the governor's door. In that point of view, I think you're much more susceptible to political intimidation for kind of favors being done. On this project, you folks might want to look the other way. And SHPO in Minnesota had been a very aggressive agency. They had often gone above and beyond their Section 106 requirements or their kind of purview, and had voiced opinions that were unpopular to lawmakers and to developers. And I think our concern in the state was from a CRM point of view that, one, a lot of that had generated a lot of work because it generated extra surveys, it had generated extra archaeology and extra cultural resource work, but also it was a check and balance kind of thing between the agencies, the state government, the federal government, and also the tribes, that it was giving basically another voice that was independent. And in the situation that's coming up, it may not be the case, but it will certainly be harder for the SHPO to be kind of an independent, standalone, do what we think is right kind of agency.
Is there really any solid evidence that people have other than developers saying they're picking on me or something like that? Is there any solid evidence that anybody has that SHPO has done these kinds of things in the past?
Well, I have. Nobody's gone on record. It's certainly all been hearsay and second guessing, but it's been confirmed by multiple sources that I've listened to and gotten emails through this, that it seems to be this is pretty much the plot and how it unfolded. The bill was passed from a relatively junior rural senator who just happened to have this large mine in his district, and it basically got streamlined right through the state legislature, from what I understand. And it's fairly clear that no one was really aware of what SHPO did or what SHPO was, just that they were a bump in the road that somebody had taken offense to.
Okay. According to the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers website, ncshpo.org, Stephen Elliott is the current SHPO of Minnesota. Is that correct?
That's correct. He's the current head of the SHPO organization. Yep.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure SHPOs are appointed, aren't they?
Generally, they are. Yeah. The working end of the SHPO, the budget, the staffing, things like that, are generally in most states are not appointed. They're basically done from the top down.
Okay. So I guess my question is, do you know anything about Stephen Elliott, his background, what kind of person he is, just like as a person?
No, I do not. I've only worked with kind of the working end of SHPO, and like most SHPOs, the actual SHPO themselves tends to be more of a political figure, a fundraiser, things like that. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. A lot of the work is done by the deputies, although I noticed they only have one deputy listed, so some states have multiples. Okay. So what's kind of going on now? Now that, I mean, this was weeks ago that we started talking about this on Facebook and things were going down. Now we've gone through, or we're in the middle of right now, as we're recording this, the holiday season. So a lot of state offices are closed or in a, kind of a downsized mode as people go on vacation and stuff. Do you have any idea what's happening now with the Minnesota SHPO?
Yeah, we've gotten some information. One of the major complaints that I had filed and that a lot of us have filed, and a lot of this had come out of the Council for Minnesota Archaeology, which is kind of the professional group in the state, and also a lot of just the CRM contractors, was that we were getting no information. This had come down in March, and here we were 9 months later, and nobody had presented a plan. Nobody had this is how we're going to restructure. This is how budgets are going to change. How many people are going to lose their jobs? How many are we going to add staff? Maybe are we going to add facilities? We had none of that 9 months later, and we were looking at an implementation in the next March. So they were 3 months from essentially doing it, and had told no one what their plan was. And there was a certain lack of transparency there. And it appeared that there had been internal discussions about this, but there had never been anything put out for the public or for the general CRM community to be aware of. And so we kind of organized a little, I guess you'd call it an internet ruckus, and we did. We got plenty of responses back. I got calls from the Minnesota SHPO's office explaining what they were aware of, what was going on. The former state archaeologist the state archaeologist in Minnesota does work out of the Department of Administration. And so he had just retired, and he had a wealth of information about kind of the Department of Administration's plans. And we heard from some folks from the Department of Administration, and there seems to be a general consensus that neither group really knows what they want to do with the other. The Department of Administration has no idea what a SHPO does or where to put a SHPO, and the SHPO has no idea how to work within the Department of Administration. So it doesn't look like it's necessarily going to be a nefarious deal so much as it is a chaotic kind of make it up as we go along scenario, which could be good or it could be bad.
Right. I think it's interesting, as I was just looking around on the directory page again for the state SHPOs. Wisconsin, Iowa, and North Dakota all have SHPO offices based in state historical societies, and all the states around Minnesota there. Have you heard any chatter in the other states about what's going on in Minnesota and possibly happening in their states as well?
I did hear some chatter from Michigan, who had apparently gone through a similar process back in the mid to late 80s. And they had, in a similar kind of line of view, they had a strong advocating SHPO who had got in the way of special interests and had essentially been politically neutered and placed in an office and with their budget cut, their staff cut, and had become a non-factor. And that essentially now in Michigan, the SHPO was no longer a player in significant preservation efforts. And that they saw those individuals saw the writing on the wall in Minnesota as, you're going to see what we saw, 30, 40 years ago happen in Minnesota. So there was some concern there.
Okay. Well, so as we're talking about this, I'm thinking back on the Facebook discussion that you started, and I know you were pretty closely following that. And there was a lot of comments in there, and some of the comment threads, as they usually do on Facebook, went in completely different directions. But what was your sense on from the two different groups? What was your overall sense of people's take on the situation?
In Minnesota or on Facebook?
In Minnesota, as a result of the conversations on Facebook. That's what I'm wondering. Like the people that were commenting there, most of whom probably aren't in Minnesota or have ever worked there because it's Facebook, so they're all over the place. But they're commenting on the situation. What was your sense of archaeologists and how they thought about the situation, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, I think, all archaeologists have a, invested interest in keeping historic preservation laws and agencies as strong as they can be. And I think that was kind of the groundswell that we saw. And the comments that came into the kind of the review hotline, we're overwhelmingly, pro SHPO. We need to support the SHPO. The SHPO needs more funding. It needs more facilities, and that helped. I think that got the message across that the SHPO was not just another government office somewhere that no one ever dealt with or no one ever used. That they were crucial to both the public sector, the tribal sector, and the private business communities. Mm-hmm. And then, I also got a lot of feedback from kind of the older guard in Minnesota saying, and this is kind of a Minnesota cultural thing, we should just play nice and not get upset, and it'll all work out in the end, and let's have some casserole.
Right. Some hot dish.
Yeah, some hot dish, exactly. We all just need to have some hot dish and calm down,
Right.
And there's certainly a point to that. But the fact that you had gone 9 months without any kind of comment or feedback. I mean, the only thing even mentioning this on the Minnesota Historical Society webpage was a 2-paragraph statement about how SHPO was moving, and we hope it'll work out for the best.
That sounds great. We hope it'll work out for the best.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, I think, I honestly don't know what to think about this. I give everybody the benefit of the doubt sometimes, and I think that because I know a few people that work in the SHPO office here in Nevada, and I've known people that have transitioned into those offices in other states, and I guess, you're right that the SHPO, the actual State Historic Preservation Officer, it is an appointed position, and I don't know what the requirements are for that appointment. Can they appoint somebody that has no clue what archaeology is or preservation is or anything? Obviously, they might not be archaeologists, but do they know anything about preservation? Are they even in that sector, or were they just appointed as a political person? And are there requirements for that appointment is something I think that I would want to know. But anyway, the people that end up working for them in that office, are typically just field techs and crew chiefs and project managers that want a steady paycheck and benefits. And they look for those state jobs and those agency jobs. And I always think that they're probably trying to do the best that they can do in that office, despite maybe what the office wants them to do. But I feel it's like similar for White House employees. They just try to do best by their job, but despite who's sitting in that office. But who knows? Sonia, I want to get to your comments real quick. You're saying something similar happened to Utah. What went down with that in the last minute of this segment?
Well, several years ago, there was a huge uproar in the Utah. I want to say the Utah SHPO, but it wasn't the Utah SHPO. It was the Utah State Archaeologists, the state archaeologist and the assistant state archaeologist, as well as the state forensic anthropologist and another individual were all abruptly let go. And it was almost like, and this is from me seeing this from the outside, not from what happened within. So I'm not 100% on what happened. But essentially they got rid of the Utah State Archaeologists. They stripped the Division of State History of permitting rights, if you want to call that. So state history used to permit archaeological companies and the individuals under those companies to do archaeology in the state. And that was all stripped from them and then sent over to a new office, the Public Lands Policy Coordinating Office, which is directly under the governor.
We're going to go to break real quick, but I want to ask you when we get back from the break, what was the result of what's going on now? So we'll do that when we get back from the break. In the meantime, go to arcpodnet.com/members to check us out and support us, and we'll send you some little swag and some stickers and things, and you'll be supporting the podcast. Plus, you'll get access to bonus content, which will include a pretty fun blooper and outtake reel that I can't say won't include some of Steven's ums and Ruckus's meows. So I think if you want to hear that in the outtake reel, you'll need to be a member. Really solid quality stuff. We'll be back in a second.
This network is supported by our listeners. You can become a supporting member by going to arcpodnet.com/members and signing up. As a supporting member, you have access to high-quality downloads of each show and a discount at our future online store and access to show hosts on a members-only Slack team. For professional members, we'll have training shows and other special content offered throughout the year. Once again, go to arcpodnet.com/members to support the network and get some great extras and swag in the process. That's arcpodnet.com/members.
All right, welcome back to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 127, where we are talking with Mr. Ryan Howell about the Minnesota SHPO situation. And right at the end of the last segment, Sonia was talking about a relatively similar thing that happened in Utah. Sonia, now that time has passed after what you'd mentioned at the end of the segment, did all hell break loose? Is Utah gone down the tubes because of that, or is is everything okay now? Like, what happened as a result of what you mentioned, the stripping of people and rights and powers and things?
Well, I would say it's all about perspective. I mean, if you think about what's going on right now with the state of Utah and how the state of Utah treats its cultural heritage, I don't know if that's a direct effect of stripping the state history of its state archaeologists, but I can say that it is disappointing what our administration is doing in terms of Utah state administration, in terms of our cultural heritage. But I mean, overall, now we just go through a different process in order to get our permits. Individuals are permitted instead of companies. So before, say my company would submit an application to the SHPO, and under that application, we would submit the names of all of our field directors and principal investigators and crew chiefs for permits. Now everybody who is permitted to do work in the state of Utah is permitted as a principal investigator, no matter what your level or qualification, as long as you have a master's degree and you meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. The SHPO doesn't manage that, and I'm using SHPO and state history almost interchangeably, but they are two separate offices. So we have the Division of State History, who manages records and some of the background information, and then we have the SHPO, who manages the Section 106, Section 110, all the compliance work, and the consultation with other agencies and commenting and things like that. So it's still, I mean, it was a very abrupt change, and it scared the living crap out of a lot of people, figuratively speaking. But it was just awkward at first, and there was a lot of emotion involved in it. And it's a very sensitive issue when your governor cuts the budget on what is generally perceived as a malicious or political move, because, they felt like, well, I don't want to put words in their mouths, but the general feeling was that the governor's office felt like they were holding up projects. Archaeologists were holding up projects and not issuing permits, like excavation permits and things like that. Things go relatively smoothly. Essentially, they've knocked two positions down into one part-time position.
Okay.
It just takes, it can take some time to have your data recovery plan reviewed and improved and things like that. But we're not talking about getting rid of the SHPO. In fact, we've got our SHPO, who is not an archaeologist, but we also have a deputy SHPO who is, and an individual who handles buildings and structures, who consult together. We've got people qualified to review at the Section 106 and 110 levels, and then we have our SHPO, who is just appointed.
Okay. Ryan, you had a question.
Yeah, I think you kind of answered it, Sonia. My question is, when you saw a transition like that, did you see a flushing out of staff? You said that it dropped from two positions to one part-time position. Was there someone who stayed on, or was there just a completely new person hired? And if so, did you see any change in their perspective or their willingness to kind of stand up and kind of stand in front of cultural resources a little bit?
Well, we had two positions that were completely cut out, and these were senior level positions, and they were cut. And then that one part-time position, and this isn't the SHPO. This is the state archaeologists. That one position was transferred to a completely separate office in the governor's office. It's called the Public Lands Coordinating Office. PLPCO is what we call it, a Public Lands Policy Coordinating Office. So, yeah, I mean, there was a little bit of grumbling. Those two positions just were completely gone. They were.
I'm sorry. Who filled the part-time position? Was that one of the senior staff who had been at OSA, or was that a completely new junior staff member?
That was another archaeologist. The archaeologist on staff, let's see, is David Yoder, and he is, I believe he's part-time. And he reports directly to the Public Lands Policy Coordinating Office, and that's Kathleen Clark, the director of that office. And then she reports directly to the governor's office. Did I answer your question? I'm not.
I think Ryan was asking more generally, when the experienced people were kicked out, who was brought in? People who knew what they were doing or people who didn't know what they were doing?
David Yoder knows what he's doing. He's an archaeologist.
Yeah,
he's a professional.
Well, that's good. Yeah, I know David. David's cool. So, Stephen, do you have any other questions? I think we're going to move on if you don't.
Yeah, I was pretty quiet throughout most of this because we had already kind of hashed out what we thought was going to happen and stuff like that. And I think that I ended the last episode with the idea that, we just kind of sit and wait and see how it plays out and go from there. So kind of along the same lines, now that we've heard a little bit more of how things are working their way through, Ryan, what do you think the what's next? What do we do? Or what do archaeologists who work in Minnesota do? Is it a plan of action, or are we just waiting to see what goes down? What's next?
Yeah, I think that we've basically done what we can at this point. I mean, the comment period ended on the 31st. We at least have an idea of what they're thinking about doing. Basically, we have nothing to do until they come up with their system and their plan, and then announce it. All of us will obviously be watching very carefully to see, if there are staffing cuts or if there are budget cuts or if there are facility cuts. But until it actually gets up and running again, we really can't have any kind of way to judge. The only issue there would be, how long does it take to get up and running again? If SHPO is offline for a week, a month, 6 months, that has implications as well. So
the only other crappy thing that I can add about the Utah situation was that the state archaeologist's office oversaw public education and archaeology. Mm-hmm. They had a few public education programs for schools and people just generally interested. And as far as I'm aware, that's no longer the case. We used to have data recovery projects out on Antelope Island, in other parts of the state, where the state actually came out with these kids, with these adults, and trained them and taught them how to do archaeology. And why historic preservation was so important. And so we no longer have a structured program for that. We still have the Utah State Archaeological Society, which unfortunately is full of more like older retirees, so who are interested in archaeology and want to go out and do like recordings and preserve sites and things. But we're coming up short on people who have the qualifications who want to assist them. or have the time to assist. And that's part of what the state archaeologist's office did. So it's unfortunate. So if you want to ask, like that question you asked earlier is how has it affected us? I felt personally that it was a more political move, cutting of a budget of unnecessary programs, but it was a political move by the governor's office to reduce education and involvement in cultural resources in our state. And our state is quite rich with cultural resources. And as you've seen so far this year, we've already had 2 of our national monuments cut quite significantly, both Bears Ears and Escalante, Grand Staircase Escalante. And that's the concern. The less education that you get out of cultural into the public for cultural resources, the less people tend to care.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point, and it's a good point to, I think, actually transition on to our next topic, because speaking of structure and education, one of the things that came out of and before we really get into this, I want to say we're going to talk about unions ultimately, because unions bring a lot of things to the table as far as structure and education go. And we're going to get into that. Before I do, though, I want to mention, as I mentioned in the introduction, that Bill White might come in. He joined us during this call. So, Bill, welcome to the show. I know you're in some airport somewhere, probably San Francisco or Oakland. I'm not sure where, but welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, I am here in San Francisco. Yeah. I prefer Oakland, but you take what you can get, right?
I guess so. All right, so let's transition this then, because I think it's a good point to do that. As I was saying, Ryan, I can't even remember where the heck a topic of unions happened in the last 2 or 3 weeks, because it happens all the time and is always filtering into one conversation or another. You mentioned this at the beginning when we were talking before the show, about talking about unions. How do you think if CRM archaeologists or CRM professionals more broadly, if we wanted to do it that way, were to unionize, how do you think we would have responded to this situation? Or what do you think that would do for us before we really get into the weeds on what unions are?
Yeah, I don't know if it really would have, but it would have given us another voice. We have, there was the group that had the most vested interest in this was the Council for Minnesota Archaeology, or at least the one that I was most involved in. There's also a group for historic architecture. There's also a group for public education, but neither of those 3 groups wanted to make a public statement or a public presence, because they were all either employed by or received funding from one or both of those agencies that were involved. And so you essentially had, everyone was under essentially a non-disclosure agreement of some form or another, and had a vested interest. I think if we had a union, particularly one that had local chapters in every state, you would have an archaeological and hopefully just cultural resource community that was beholden, to no other agency or department or historical society that employed them all, because there would be too many, and most of them would be in the private sector.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it always strikes me as odd, because when we talk about unions, because we always bring up things like, we have a voice and collective bargaining and all the hallmarks of unions, right? And then you get down into, leveling out pay and benefits and stuff like that. That's always, part of the union conversation. But before somebody leaves us a comment on this, what's your perception, Ryan, of the American Cultural Resources Association, ACRA, because they claim to be the voice for CRM?
Well, they're the voice for the CRM company owners, but I don't think they're the voice for the vast majority of archaeologists. I think for those of us that have our own businesses or who need to lobby for CRM laws to not be further curtailed, they're certainly an advocate for that, but I don't think they're worried about that crew chief with no health insurance and working on his third broken disc somewhere out there in Colorado. That's not their concern.
Yeah, so I think ACRA's approach is a kind of a top-down thing where they think that if they act through the CRM owners and the CRM firms, that those policies that they're working on them with and in government with will filter down to everybody else. But that clearly hasn't worked because we're still having the conversation about health benefits and pay and a collective voice for people who aren't firm owners and PIs and things like that. So their approach, if they think that's what they're doing, isn't actually working. And I don't know if I had conversations with people about the RPA, the Registered Professional Archaeologist, not too long ago, because they were having their elections. And, my thing was, a lot of people think RPA is ineffective as well for what they do or what people think they should do. And the way to fix most of these organizations is to get in them and fix it yourself, or form an entirely new organization, which would be some sort of union. So, I don't know. Ryan, what do you think? Do you think, just getting your opinion on this because you're new to the show, what do you think fixing like RPA and ACRA would help us to get on the path to helping everybody, since those organizations already do exist and they already do have a structure? Or do you really think starting a brand new thing is the way to go?
I think we've got to start a brand new thing. I think we need to build a system that is ground up and works from the bottom up, and it needs to include management level people as well. But I don't think you have an inherent conflict of interest when you're talking about labor versus people who make money when labor is not getting better wages. Mm-hmm. You've got management versus labor, and ACRA and RPA, for the most part, are interested in management. And I think if you're going to have an organization that is going to deal with labor, you're going to need to build it from the ground up, and it's going to be a different body. Now, how those three entities would interface, I don't know. You would hope that they could, kind of find a way to interact positively, and I don't think that there's any real reason, that ACRA would have a real, witch hunt against a union. I think they'd applaud the fact that it was getting organized, but I just don't think that. I think they've given into the old argument about unions, which is, how do you get archaeologists to organize about anything, for longer than 5 minutes, and of those that are going to organize, most of them are going to be in the management sector by the time they're, in their 30s or 40s anyway. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, indeed. Well, and I want to talk more about that. The organization and what we can do about that. And we'll do that shortly when we come back from the break for our third segment. In the meantime, as I've mentioned before, we are constantly looking for new co-hosts to the CRM Arc podcast. Nobody's losing their job, but job implies you get paid for it, just like CRM. Anyway, but we want, fresh opinions. Like, it's great having Ryan in here to just talk CRM stuff and the things that we're doing. So if you're interested in co-hosting on a part-time or more regular basis, then contact me, Chris at archaeologypodcastnetwork.com, or on all the socials at arcpodnet. We'll be back in a second for segment 3. Hey, podcast listeners. Do you find yourself wondering what the latest tablet or smartphone could do for your business? Wonder what GPS to pair with your device? Just trying to figure out how to go digital in the field without breaking the bank and or making a bad investment? Or did you find a technology company to work with but just aren't sure the questions you need to ask during the initial conversation? Well, you're not alone. There are literally thousands of tech combinations out there, and it can be really tough finding the right one for your business and your workflow. My name is Chris Webster, and I've been working in CRM since 2005, and I've been a tech enthusiast my entire life. I spend my time trying to figure out how to make archaeology more efficient both technologically and financially. No one is going to give you a big pile of money to do whatever you want with, so you have to make the most of what you have. The right gear can mean the difference between zero margins on that next project and an employee benefits package. That's where DigTech Concierge comes in. Let us be your technology guru. Whether you have just a few questions or want us on retainer 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, we're here to help. With years of experience, tens of thousands of acres of survey done completely digitally, and many, many people trained, DigTech is your tech BFF, just waiting to guide you through this process now and through the inevitable changes to come. Should you hold on to those tablets or upgrade? What about the new operating system? Will it crash your apps, or can you go ahead and do it? We know the answers and can guide you to a profitable year. go to www.digtech-llc.com/tech-concierge to book a consultation or book us for the year. The yearly retainer includes unlimited calls and support and company training on software and gear. That's digtech-llc.com/tech-concierge. And concierge is CONCIERGE. To get going and go digital today. Call us before you make any decisions. We've been there before. Okay, we're back for our final segment of the CRM podcast, episode 127, and now we're talking about unions. So, Bill, you had a follow-up question to the last segment.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Ryan about his statement that we needed to start all over and kind of just throw the baby out with the bathwater and create another group that's associated and related to bettering the situation of specifically field techs. I mean, that's the one thing that I'd like to see improved because as someone who teaches at universities, I can see in the next 10, 20 years there being a real drain because it costs so much money to go to college and nobody's willing to go and, get paid minimum wage essentially to do something that takes a college degree. So how are we going to continue getting students if we don't increase the wages? So I'm really interested in that, but I'm also apprehensive about creating a whole new thing because also being a new individual who's moved to California, I'm learning that there's a new thing for everything. So there's a new office of the so-and-so and a new branch of the vice chancellor of the county commissioner, right? And it creates this morass where you've got to go through this ridiculous obstacle course just to get anything, your driver's license, to get a new prescription for glasses, all this kind of stuff. It just all builds up. So I'm wondering if there's some kind of a way for us to increase the membership of techs in ACRA and then have their own caucus or faction that, votes lockstep together. And by showing membership in the thing, not only does it increase the membership of their organization, but it can create a powerful voting block that's essentially saying, don't do this, or yeah, go ahead and do this. It makes our voices heard in their organization. Because if we set up our other side thing, they'll just be like American Antiquity. I don't subscribe to it. I don't really read it unless I have to. So I have no idea what's going on in Zapotec archaeology these days, right? So I have no idea what anyone's even thinking. If we create our own field tech thing, they won't have any idea what we're thinking, and then they'll find out that we have a thing, and then they'll be like, oh, okay, well, you guys go do your own thing, okay? Build political power, do it yourself, and we'll be over here with our other thing. So what do you think about that?
You certainly got a point, Bill. I mean, you can do it one of two ways. You can, you can certainly take an organization like ACRA or even RPA, although RPA is not really built like that, and, take it over from within and make it into what you want it to be, and basically run the agenda from within an organization that's already up and standing. And there's certainly arguments to be made for that. I guess, my background is, my family is in trades, in the plumbers, electricians, carpenters, and I've seen unions work, and I see how unions work, for the lowest of the low. And yes, there are issues in unions as well as anything else, but you have a much broader pyramid, I would say, and shallower pyramid than you do in an organization that's like ACRA, where you have, 2 or 3 individuals at the top, essentially running an organization like that. But you're right. You could certainly, if everyone showed up to the ACRA meeting and voted together as a block, you could change ACRA overnight, and that would be an equally viable strategy.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I think would be more powerful, because there's not really that many archaeologists in the United States. So when we show up to lobby our Congress, they're just kind of like, well, how much money do you guys have? Oh, none? Okay, well, take your seat back there with the other people doing the bake sales for votes. So if we don't all join together, then it'll kind of be like the company owners over here, all 15 of them that paid the $100 membership, right? And then the other 9,000 techs are going to be, over in a corner. But if they all show up and say, yeah, we're all part of this whole thing and we're 10,000 strong, you see that actually that has a little bit more impact.
Yeah, I mean, the counter argument to that would be that we get the 15 individuals would just stop paying their ACRA dues, walk across the street, and start, ACRA 2 up. But the one thing I think we need to look at here is where it's been successful, and that's in England and in Britain. And if what you really need to have on here is a guy named Dave Connolly, and how they got things organized over there. And given that's a much more, union, labor friendly, sensitive country, and their laws are a lot different, but they basically changed their field in a matter of 6 months by going to a union system. And in a strange way, they did it off of their job boards, which, is an odd way to go about it. But, I think right now, I've been involved in this, going all the way back to the early 90s, and it rises its head and then falls and rises and falls. But I think now with the social media, with everybody more connected, the tools are there now for folks that don't have a lot of power, don't have a lot of money, to generate influence beyond their capital nowadays. In the old days, we used to do it with newsletters and phone lists, and it was pretty easy to just blacklist everybody off of projects. But I think, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, you can really get, quite a few of us together if we all decide that we want to do a thing.
Yeah, I we're going to get to Stephen's comment here in a second, but I fully agree with that, Ryan. We have a lot more power than we think we do, and it's like any voting situation. If we wanted billionaires out of office and we could all get off our asses and vote, then we would get billionaires out of office. I mean, that's just a fact. If we wanted to change ACRA, we could do that. If we wanted to change RPA, we could do that. Full disclosure, I ran for one of the positions in RPA because it was suggested that I do that, and I was the way RPA works is, I don't know if it always works this way, but there's usually two people up for a position, and I was up against, I don't even know who else, and I lost. And I actually am curious as to the vote count on that, because I didn't see the other person posting anywhere, and I was on this podcast, I was all over Facebook and things like that. But I did find out in the end, actually before the vote took place, I found out that they take the votes into account, but in the end, it's the current RPA administration that decides who gets it. It's not strictly a voting situation, which I'm not really sure why voting even happens, but that's absolutely sinister to me. Yeah, that seems like it's just a trade group. Seriously. Mm-hmm. I mean, I really hope that they're listening to this, because that's the kind of situation that really doesn't have any place in here. And that's the reason why these guys are always shuffling around for the lowest bid and doing every single thing that they possibly can to get contracts, rather than actually strengthening themselves, because they submarine their own candidates. Yeah, indeed. Stephen, you had a comment from before.
Yeah, and this is kind of a comment, kind of a question for everybody. But, Ryan was talking about the situation in the UK where having unions has improved the situation. But if I recall, wasn't there a thing where you had to volunteer a whole lot of your, personal time before you even could get positions? There was that whole free labor outrage on Twitter a couple of years ago.
Free archaeology.
I remember that. I don't know the specifics of it, but yeah, there was the way that they basically did it is that they classified field what would be our definition of field technicians and crew chiefs, field directors, whatever, into categories, and you had to have a certain amount of hours and projects and time in the field to be at a category. But once you were classified as that category, you had to be hired at a wage commensurate with that category. And so instead of someone posting an ad saying, $11 plus depending on experience, it was, I need 3 C5s, 2 C7s, and 1 C9. And if you were hired as a C9, you got paid C9 wages. And otherwise, they just simply wouldn't post the job, and you'd never get your positions filled.
Right, but the outrage, as I recall, was about, like, in order to get to those levels, you had to put in a certain amount of free labor, which doesn't seem like a viable.
Well, we have field schools,
Yeah, no, this is beyond that. Like, they had their field school, and then you had to volunteer before you could get positions. And like I say, I don't remember the details of it, but if that's somehow tied to the unionship, or, you know, if the union hasn't counteracted that sort of thing, that would be a major concern.
Yeah, we'd have to get someone on who is more familiar with that than we are. So
we could get David on. I'm sure he'd come on the podcast. So David used to podcast himself when he was host of the Stone Pages Archaeology News podcast. So and I've talked to David. I talked to David in Scotland actually a couple of years ago about some of this stuff, and it's fascinating how it all worked out. And you're right. Since we don't know the specifics, we should get him on. But Ryan, something you said about, you know, going through Badger, their jobs resource that David was part of and started. That's an interesting thought too, because so far we've talked about two organizations that currently exist that are in the minds of most field techs from that level are acting ineffectively, which are ACRA and RPA. But we've got one more that is also independently run by one person that we all know and use, and that's Shovel Bums. And I've talked to Arjo Brandon before about beefing that up and making the requirements a little more strict for job posting and actually requiring certain information. And that is on the step towards what you were saying Badger did with the C1. I think C9 is the highest. I can't remember how many levels they've got, but they've got a massive amount of levels, not just like 3 or 4. There's a lot of divisions in there. And you're right. They require people to list those positions and pay within those positions, or they're not listing on that resource. And that works because that's just about the only place for people to list jobs. And with archaeology in this country, in the United States, we essentially have one and then a second place that we list jobs, and that's Shovelbums and archaeologyfieldwork.com. And for one reason or another, I'm not really sure what the reason is. Maybe because people just know the term shovel bum and it's been around a while. Arc Fieldwork actually started before Shovel Bums. So they've both been around for a long time. But for one reason or another, Shovel Bums has become like the go-to for people looking for jobs. And I just wish that Arjo Brandon would beef that up a little bit and put a little more structure on it. That's what we tried to do with PCS Job Board a while back, but we didn't really promote it very much. We were actually curating job posts with a form, and if you didn't have all the information, then we wouldn't post your job. But you know, we didn't have the infrastructure to really promote that out. So anyway, Stephen, I think you had the first comment on there.
Yeah, the problem with that is you don't have to go through Shovel Bums, and most of us don't. That, you know, we hire from outside of Shovel Bums or Arc Fieldwork, unless we, you know, there's a sudden, you know, expansion of like, you know, we need way more warm bodies than we've ever had.
Sure.
And nobody likes it.
Mm-hmm.
Like everybody I know who's hired through Shovel Bums hates the experience. And it's not because it's Shovel Bums. It's because you are going to get, you know, you're looking for 5 people. You're going to get like 75 applications, and a good portion of them are not qualified, like they're not considerable for whatever reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, because people are just shotgunning it out without, you know, thinking about the cover letter at all. And you know, it's, you know, it comes down to the question. It's like, well, you know, you didn't address any of the requirements in the job posting, so why should I, you know, give that to you?
Yeah.
So, you know, that's like a serious issue, is that, you know, like Shovel Bums, yeah, it's got a structure and you can make it more rigorous, but it's not going to do much because, you know, you're not passing on that rigor to the applicants.
Mm-hmm.
And then also it's a last gasp thing. Like, you know, it's the, oh crap, I need people and I can't find anybody. And at that point, you've already canvassed like all your, you know, colleagues who also hire, who might have people looking for work, or you've already canvassed all the local universities who might, you know, have students who are looking for work. And you know, it's not the best solution. Some people have tried with like more like job placement, which I think is a much more interesting idea of trying to get, you know, like basically be subcontractors for labor, you know, like a temp agency or something like that. And I think that's a really interesting idea. You know, I don't know how well that works or how easy it is to, you know, like how it's being received by the people who do employment.
Yeah, when Connolly's work was going on, I saw that and I'm like, well, I wonder if that would work here. So I contacted our Joe and I contacted Jennifer Palmer and I said, are you interested in trying something like that here to see if we can get some movement? And basically, I think Joe's response was that, he was here to serve the tech community and he didn't want, kind of a political thing to interfere with kind of what he saw as his service role. And Jennifer just did not want to have any kind of political content on her page or advocate for any kind of political stance. But I think, you got to realize that there's been a gradual, change over the last, at least I've seen it in the last 20, 25 years in our business, where we're becoming more corporatized. And, when corporate people want to hire, they want to hire quickly and they want to hire in mass. They want to get 150 applicants because they've got someone in their HR department whose job it is to look through 150 applications. Mm-hmm. And you see sites like Indeed or all the post your resumes, the sites there. I think if we got ahead of that game, where if you were talking about what's a field tech, is a field tech someone who just got their field school, or is it someone who's been doing this for 15 years and can pretty much run a project from scratch? If we had those kind of classifications where if you were posting on any job from any corporations, you had a fairly strict hierarchy of what you could do, I think that would help us out. Maybe or maybe not, but it seemed to work in Great Britain. So,
yeah, I honestly think this is the way, because already the way that it is, you hire people who have a bachelor's degree and a field school under their belt. I mean, this is just basically codifying even more information, like how to use a Trimble, or how to actually download the Trimble and use GPS. I mean, like you were saying, we have people who are applying that have 15 years experience and 500, projects, but they've never even, scheduled the hotel room. So they know none of the admin. They just know how to dig a unit. And then you have individuals who have only been in there for 4 or 5 years that have a master's degree and have done basically everything because they worked at a small company, including contracting and all that stuff, right? So really, if you're looking for someone to just dig holes, you want to find the guy who's excellent at that and done it in every state in the union. If you want to find the person who actually can be cultivated to be management or run projects or actually be, an asset, then you want to try to find that. But you're right. The way that it's set up, Stephen is exactly right. That's why I wrote a whole book about it. People just take these generic resumes and spam them all out. And then he's the one who has to sit there over breakfast and dinner and sort through them all to try and find one individual that they could possibly hire. With the rating system that you're talking about, that takes all the mystery away. They've got a Class C rating. They can do X, Y, Z. They've got a so-and-so experience level with the Trimble. They have this much excavation experience in all these different places. And it's literally like, you could set it up where it's what states have you worked in? What counties? What companies did you work for? How many years? Blah, blah, blah. And you just click it all. And based on if they do the job listing correctly and upload it to Shovel Bones, it just rates all the people.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the things here is, how do you get those ratings? Well, a union is one way to do it. That's how they do apprentice, journeyman, and masters. And if you have a rating like that, you can say, hey, I'm a C5. C5s get paid this.
You just need companies to enforce it, which is the other thing. You need companies to back that up and say, well, if we do hire quote C5s, then we're going to pay them this rate. Right. Because you'll get a company in there in this country, because there's a lot more companies here that'll just be like, screw that whole system. I'm going to pay them whenever the hell they want to pay them, and then go from there. So we need some enforcement, which is how we come back to unions.
Yep.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, I wish we had more time for this, but we don't. In the meantime, I would say, use and be more active in the resources we already have until maybe we get something going that is unique and brand new. I'm always willing to help out if somebody wants to start something like that. So definitely give me a call and I'll be on board with it. But until then, thanks, Ryan, and thanks everybody else for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for another episode of the CRM Archaeology Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.archpodnet.com/CRM Arc Podcast. Send your questions to Chris at archaeologypodcastnetwork.com or on all the socials at ArchPodNet. Support the show and the network over at archpodnet.com/members. Finally, send us show and interview suggestions for stuff that you want to know about. Thanks to everyone for joining me this week. Thanks also to the listeners for tuning in, and we'll see you in the field. Goodbye.
Bye.
Adios.
Adios.
Where's Doug?
This show is produced and recorded by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, in Reno, Nevada, at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.